Hi guys, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about a book I found called Fuck Them Kids, The One-Sided Narrative of the Estrangement Epidemic and the Biased Therapy Trends That Fuel It. Already, right off the bat, a really interesting title and subtitle. Regarding the title, so I get that it's probably meant to be sort of provocative, a little bit inflammatory as maybe rage bait marketing. Obviously, I'm wondering at this point, is this really the type of loving parental energy that you want to be leading with as a parent accused of causing their child intense pain? Regarding the estrangement epidemic, I would point out that estrangement is nothing new. It's as old as time itself. It's just that, back in the day before globalization and digitalization, when people chose to estrange themselves, they would just go, across the world and literally never see their parents again. But now with social media, people are a lot more vocal about it. It's something that's a lot more out in the open. And as for the biased therapy trends that fuel estrangement, from my point of view, therapy is now allowing generations to heal from toxic family patterns. And what I mean by the word toxic is just something that causes serious harm, like a toxic plant, a toxic ingredient. It's something that could be very dangerous, that poses a danger to people's well-being. That's how I define toxic. So I think that therapy is allowing people to become more aware of these patterns, to discuss them, to be more vocal about them, to emotionally process their traumas, to be validated and feel empowered to set boundaries with people. I think also for the first time in history, we have a lot more information about the impact of intergenerational trauma, and younger people are vowing to put a stop to it. But, I'm curious to see what bias trends the author is talking about. So who is the author? The author is Vivian King, PhD, as it says on the cover of her book. I do find it a little bit misleading to put her PhD on the cover because the author's doctorate is actually in engineering science, not anything to do with psychology. That's actually the reason why I don't put my doctorate credentials on my fiction books, such as my new book, A Song at Dead Man's Cove. You see no PsyD on there because the way I see it, it's just not really relevant to my fiction writing. To me, it's kind of like somebody having a doctorate in, let's say, food science, advertising that on a book about astronomy. It's just people are going to think that you have a very specialized degree in the thing that you're talking about. And if that's not the case, then again, that can be misleading. That can be a little bit of an appeal to authority to people. But the author's bio says, Vivian King, PhD, is a writer, researcher, and unapologetic truth teller on a mission to challenge toxic cultural narratives that scapegoat parents. With a doctorate in engineering science and a sharp analytical mind, she brings a unique, no-nonsense perspective to the estrangement epidemic affecting millions of families today. So I hope that unapologetic truth teller doesn't mean in this context someone who sees their perspective as the sort of truth TM, because that kind of perspective would be revealing a lot about why a rift might form between a parent and a child. If a parent thinks that their perspective is the truth with a capital T, that sometimes points to why children choose to distance themselves from their parents. I personally have not seen anybody scapegoating estranged parents, but rather just trying to hold parents accountable for the ways in which they harm their children. Accountability does not equal scapegoating, does not equal martyrdom. She goes on, as a mother, educator, and advocate for dignity and accountability, Vivian writes for parents who are tired of being blamed, silenced, and pathologized by biased therapy trends and social media echo chambers. Her work blends personal experience with critical insight, offering a powerful voice for those ready to stop chasing, stop apologizing, and start reclaiming their story. Okay, interesting that she's an advocate for accountability, considering that's, from what I've seen of the estranged parent community, something that is often missing quite a lot. And also, isn't stop apologizing sometimes in contradiction to taking accountability? Vivian currently divides her time between East Africa and the US, where she writes, creates, and lives life on her own terms. F Them Kids is her boldest work yet, a call to action for parents who refuse to be erased. So then in the dedication, she has a poem that's to her children, who she says she loves, despite being estranged. It's not clear to me if there's just one child she's estranged with or multiple. Based on the dedication, it sounds like it's all her children that she's estranged from. And if that is the case, that is, I think, an especially important situation where estranged parents need to ask themselves if there's something worth self-reflecting on, because if everyone around you can see certain patterns, not just one person, then that might be indicative of something worth looking at. She also says in the dedication, this book is not an act of anger, but of truth. Again, sort of framing her perspective as the capital T truth, which reveals a lot about her worldview, that there seems to be a correct perspective and a wrong perspective, and hers is the correct one. And she says to other estranged parents, you are not the villain, which, as you'll see, is a type of reassurance that the author feels pretty comfortable giving estranged parents who she doesn't know, and also something that she herself is preoccupied with, is justifying to herself that she's not the villain. In the preface, she again assures estranged parents that you're not the villain in this story. She says that this book will provide validation to them. She believes the estrangement epidemic is all part of a larger agenda to destroy the family. And she again positions herself as a truth teller by saying, I'm here to speak honestly with compassion and to tell the truth without flinching. I'm not sure if Them Kids gives off compassionate vibes, but again, I'm relatively sure that was just a marketing call on her part. But let's really get into this book. Let's see what's in it. So the introduction of the book specifies that this book is not for parents who were truly abusive. And the thing that I always wonder with books like this is, how do you know that abusive parents won't pick it up? How do you feel comfortable reassuring someone who you don't know and validating them that they are not the villain when they could in fact be abusive for all you know? And then she sort of laments what even is abuse today. It's lost its meaning as a word. She claims that the legal definition of abuse is intentional harm or injury to another person. And I'm no legal expert, so I won't comment on the legal definition, but the psychological definition of abuse absolutely does not require intentionality. Sure, maybe if someone accidentally hurts you, in some cases it hurts less than if they intentionally hurt you. The example I like to give is, if you're walking down the street and somebody hurls a basketball at you, you might be a little bit less forgiving of that versus if somebody is playing basketball with their neighbor and the ball accidentally rolls onto you. It's still going to hurt, likely just as much, but one you might be a little bit more sympathetic to than the other. But in my opinion, most abuse comes from people who have trauma histories of their own and simply don't know how to regulate their emotions or be honest with themselves, who project their own issues onto other people and try to exert power and control over other people because they feel powerless in their own lives. In most cases, they're not people who are intentionally going out of their way to cause harm to other people. That is something that happens unintentionally because of unresolved stuff that they have going on. So the psychological definition of abuse has absolutely nothing to do with intentionality. Dr. King reveals that she was in regular contact with her daughter, husband, and their new baby when out of the blue her daughter cut her off, saying that she harbors resentment from her childhood. And now, obviously, I don't know the specific situation here, but I want to mention 3 things. Number 1, the vast majority of estrangement happens not because of the past, but because of the present. There may have been things that happened in the past that were activated by present day ongoing patterns. But most adult children who are in happy, healthy relationships with their parents are not ruminating over the ways in which they were wronged as children. The ruminating continues if there are still serious things going on in their relationship in the present day. For example, I know a few adult children who flat out told their parents that they were abusive growing up, but because their parents did the work to take accountability and change as people, they now have perfectly pleasant relationships. They didn't end up estranging themselves by any means. Number 2, new members in the family, such as a new spouse or a new child, can sometimes be triggers for old traumas. Oftentimes, when a new spouse comes into the family as an outsider, they see with greater clarity some of the unhealthy patterns going on. Because if those patterns are not common in their own family, they're like, what is going on here? And if they treat the adult child better than the parents do, then the adult child might realize, hold on, I don't deserve to be treated the way my mom or my dad treats me. And they start to feel more empowered to set boundaries. So that is why sometimes parents who end up getting estranged complain that, oh, my son-in-law or my daughter-in-law stole my child from me. And then sometimes when there's a new child in the family, the adult children of the people they are estranging themselves from sort of get to see a window into how their parents treated them as children. Usually they're pretty fiercely protective over their own children. So when they see those same behaviors that were done to them being perpetuated onto the next generation, children, that's often what prompts them to take a strong stand and remove the abusive parent. And number 3 point that I will mention is that estranged parents often claim that their adult children never told them exactly the reason why they were estranging, and estranged children often claim that they tried to tell their parents many, many times. Sometimes there is even documentation, there are other witnesses. Sometimes estranged parents will even admit in some of these forums that like, oh yeah, these are some of the reasons that my child cited, but then in the next sentence deny that their child ever told them what they did wrong. The problem here is that people who are abusive have very strong defense mechanisms that prevent them from truly listening when they're receiving negative feedback. And they simply don't metabolize the information that their children are trying to relay. Maybe there are some rare situations where an adult child didn't give their parent a reason why they were estranging themselves. I'm not going to say it never happens because the world is a very large place with billions of people in it, but I am doubtful that it happens often. No one wants to lose one of the most important relationships in their lives without first trying to fix the issue with the person that's bothering them. By the time it leads to estrangement, conflict resolution has usually been ineffective. The author says that the majority of parents did the best that they could. And I do believe that this is true. I believe that parents always do the best with the resources at their disposal. But unfortunately, sometimes a person's best is not good enough. She also says that it's downright insane to judge parents based on today's parenting standards, to which I'd like to clarify, I don't think that estranged parents are being judged by that. They're being judged by the harm caused. You know, like no one is, that I know of, shaming moms who drank during pregnancy before they knew that that was bad for a fetus. The types of parents who are being judged are the ones whose children are now saying, hey, you did XYZ thing to hurt me. And the parents seem sort of incapable of empathizing with the child's pain. So the author sort of wraps up the intro by saying this is not a book about reconciliation and this is not a book that will help you repair your relationship with your child, to which I say, hey, that much is clear. She says instead her goal is to help parents move forward from estrangement. And I admit her advice on that is actually pretty good. It's not bad at all. And then she says, as for me, I refuse to accept the role of villain in anyone's narrative. And she says she is a loving and kind person and will not be convinced otherwise. You know, I'm not sure this is super healthy. We are sometimes the villains in other people's story. And I would argue it's healthy to just accept that rather than resist it. Not because that person's necessarily right, but just because we need to accept that everyone has their own point of view and that there isn't one right version of the capital truth. You know, denying that, claiming that you're a good person when someone says you've hurt them, it comes off as defensive, and I would think a good person shows that through their actions, not their words. So in this video, my goal is to share some of the ironic inconsistencies that I caught in this book, where the author was accusing adult children of doing exactly what she was doing, clarify why some of her assertions, despite her claims that research shows or studies show, are not actually supported by the research and reflect a slight misunderstanding of the research, and point out some of the common patterns of estranged parents that are demonstrated in this book that feel to me counterproductive when dealing with estrangement. Now, obviously this book gets a lot more interesting, shall we say, but before we get into all that, a quick word from today's sponsor, Zocdoc. I love partnering with Zocdoc because it's a way for you guys to get easier access to healthcare at literally no cost to you. Zocdoc is a free app and website designed to help you find high-quality in-network providers, pick the one you want, and instantly book an appointment. It breaks down so many of the barriers in accessing healthcare, such as, needing to call someone and talk to them on the phone, making sure that they have availability as soon as you want it, making sure that they're in network, making sure that they have other things you want, like maybe you want a specific gender or a specific type of provider, or you want to make sure that they have good reviews first. Zocdoc has a database with over 100,000 providers in a wide range of specialties, who also take a wide range of insurances. You can tailor what kind of healthcare provider you're looking for, you can see their reviews, and again, it's completely free to you. All you have to do is create an account and book the type of appointment that you're searching for. Maybe you haven't been to a primary care doctor in over a year, or maybe you haven't had your biannual teeth cleaning in well over 6 months, or maybe you need your glasses prescription renewed, or maybe you have a mole that you've been putting off getting checked out. Whatever your situation is, stop procrastinating, click the link in the pinned comment and in my video description to easily book local top-rated doctors in your area who can see you quickly. Thank you to Zocdoc for sponsoring this portion of today's video, and now back to that book. So Dr. Vivian King acknowledges that estrangement is nothing new, and yet she claims that there is a concerted effort by various parties to promote estrangement in today's society. Her sort of thesis is that modern estrangement is rooted in external factors such as social trends, peer influence, social media, and incompetent therapists. She talks at length in the book about the betrayal, grief, and hurt of estranged parents, but at no point do I see her sort of wondering about the betrayal, grief, and hurt feelings of the children who estrange themselves from those parents. Because even when children are the ones who choose to estrange themselves, there's still great grief in not having a relationship with their parents. And I think that speaks to a lot of the reason why estranged children estrange themselves from their parents, is a lot of them claim that their parent is fundamentally unwilling to empathize with them in the way that a parent should. So Dr. King goes on to share how she thinks the cult-like influence of social media is encouraging estrangement. Specifically, she thinks it's suspicious that many estrangement stories told by adult children follow sort of a similar template. And she says it's a form of concept contagion and a misuse of therapy speak. Now here I'd like to point out a few things. First of all, abuse does follow a quintessential playbook, and that's why victim stories often follow a very similar structure, similar themes. That's why victims can often really relate to each other's stories, because abusers do follow a similar playbook. Number two, Dr. Vivian King herself also follows very similar patterns to other estranged parents in this book. For example, she cites the sacrifices that parents have made for their children. When she's describing estranged parents' mistakes, she uses very minimizing language, such as ordinary mistakes, misunderstandings. She calls estranged children narcissistic, ungrateful, entitled. She laments that estranged children don't take accountability while also modeling how to not take accountability in the book itself. She claims that estrangement happens out of the blue. She claims that estranged children are just brainwashed by therapists, social media, siblings, friends, as if they can't think for themselves. Using words like mass psychosis and programmed and deprogrammed and cult and group delusion, she shows a lot of defensive justifications of why estranged parents are actually good parents. She uses very Darvo-like language like walking on eggshells and doormat. So I don't really think that it's indicative of mass psychosis that adult children are using similar language to each other, because she herself uses very similar language and brings up similar themes to other estranged parents. All it really means if someone has a similar pattern is that they belong to the same group of people. Adult estranged children belong to the group of adult estranged children. Estranged parents belong to the group of estranged parents. And of course, there are going to be some similarities in those experiences that make them talk about their experiences in similar ways. Now, one thing that I found very ironic is that the author takes issue with adult children using words like abuse, gaslight, narcissist, and toxic, yet she herself uses these words on multiple occasions. Even in her bio, she uses the word toxic. At another point, she says, good, loving parents are being gaslit. These online groups perpetuate toxic ideas about family dynamics. She also questions whether adult children are actually the victims of abuse at the hands of their parents, yet she spends an entire chapter talking about the ways in which adult children abuse their parents. Which, to be clear, elder abuse does happen, and literally nothing makes me angrier than people mistreating the elderly, but it is significantly rarer than abuse by a parent towards a child. So it's kind of strange that she's claiming there's an epidemic of adult children abusing their parents, but she thinks the reverse is unrealistic. There is a power imbalance between parents and children, which is why parents are usually the ones abusive towards children rather than the other way around. I also just don't understand why she's allowed to use words like gaslight and toxic and abusive, but when adult children do it, it's weaponization of therapy speak. Dr. Vivian King not only believes estrangement can be a form of abuse towards the parents, she at multiple points in the book compares it to Germany and the Holocaust, as well as the enslavement of Black Americans. She claims that estranged children use dehumanizing language to talk about their parents, but I would under no circumstance describe her examples as dehumanizing words. The ones she points to are words like toxic and narcissistic, words that she herself uses to describe the adult children. In my opinion, these words are not about dehumanization of an entire group of people. They're about individuals. If someone is calling you toxic or narcissistic, it's not because they've dehumanized parents as a group. it's because they're giving you a specific complaint. But in her view, a lot of children are lying about the extent of the abuse that they've experienced. She claims that adult children use the words emotional abuse to encompass typical parenting missteps or disappointments, such as being late to pick up the kids from school or not celebrating my achievements the way I wanted. And while I've personally never heard of anyone cutting off their parents over such minor things, I do want to point out that even if this is true, context matters. Chronically being very late to pick up a child from school can be neglect, or at the very least send the child a message that they're an afterthought. Raining down on someone's accomplishments can be a form of emotional abuse. She's trying to make it sound trivial, but it really depends on the context and the pattern. Is this a one-off thing, or is this established within a pattern of behavior? She also says that social media is fueling the blame game, and she challenges the notion that mental health issues are caused by childhood experiences, saying maybe adult children don't follow through because they're lazy and unmotivated. Maybe they struggle with friendships because, let's face it, they're an asshole. Again, I wonder if maybe this is the kind of compassionate truth-telling that maybe alienated her own children. She also mentions that twin and adoption studies show a 40 to 60% heritability of personality traits, and she treats it as this kind of like gotcha moment that parents aren't to blame. But that completely neglects the other half of the equation, which is if half of personality is inherited, then that means the other half is triggered by environmental factors. And no environmental factor is as strong as what happens during childhood when people are like sponges. At one point she says that psychological research shows adult outcomes result from complex interactions between multiple factors including genetics, peer relationships, economic conditions, and individual choices. What's missing here? Childhood experiences, parenting, like are we really gonna pretend that that doesn't play any role at all in this multifactorial picture? It may be convenient to neglect the role of parenting, but whether Dr. King likes it or not, what happens during childhood and the type of parenting experienced has huge effects. Pick up the DSM-5 and you will see that pretty much any mental or personality disorder in there has significant parenting-related risk factors, and especially personality disorders, since Dr. King seems to imply that estranged children have personality issues. She makes it sound like adult children who estrange themselves are sort of swept up in a cult-like community rather than thinking for themselves. Understand that you're likely not dealing with their authentic voice, but rather with the influence of estrangement culture. Like I said, the words mass psychosis and group delusion get thrown around quite a bit. I find this advice to be quite harmful. Telling someone to not take their child's feelings seriously, to immediately dismiss and invalidate their feelings, to assume that they're not thinking for themselves, but rather are a puppet being blown in the wind, is going to make things significantly worse. I would actually advise the opposite of that. When your child tells you they're unhappy with something you've done, take it very seriously. Consider that perhaps you have blind spots, like anyone, and that this is something that needs to be resolved. And also, I find it curious that so many estranged parents default to invalidating their child's ability to accurately perceive reality. They're not seeing things clearly. They have mental health issues. They're just tired. They've had a hard year. They're going through a phase. They're misremembering. Their memory's faulty. They're prone to distorting things. They're swept up in a cult. They're brainwashed by a therapist or partner or sibling, and so on and so forth. All of these are examples of gaslighting, and some of them you can find in this book itself. She says that studies show when people are deeply embedded in certain shared frameworks, contradictory evidence gets reinterpreted through the existing lens rather than challenging it. And I'm not really sure what reference she's citing here because she doesn't have like footnotes specifying which source exactly she gets her information from. But I'm not sure that the study in question says what she thinks it's saying. All groups and all communities and all sort of theoretical orientations do this. All of them have shared interpretive frameworks that they filter their worldview through. She also claims neuroscience research shows that emotional content activates the amygdala, your brain's alarm system, while simultaneously decreasing activity in your prefrontal cortex, which handles rational thinking. We see here this false dichotomy between rationality and emotionality. And I actually made an entire video on this, so you can check that out up here. But basically, people who don't consider emotions in their decision-making and their morality tend to make worse decisions and be less moral people. Those with damaged emotion centers in their brain struggle significantly. Modern psychology very much acknowledges that wisdom comes from the synthesis of emotions and rationality. She also says adult children work aggressively to silence alternative narratives. And my personal opinion is This is not a conspiracy. Estranged parents also have a large growing community. It may be that estranged children are just more well-versed with social media, and because of that, they have a little bit of a power in numbers on social media. Now, if estranged children ever form a mob mentality online, that is not healthy. And also, I would ask any of you watching, please don't target this woman's books. Please don't go, for example, spamming her page with 1-star reviews if you haven't actually read her book. We can discuss things respectfully here. Let's not turn this into a mob thing. Anyway, Dr. King's proposition to move beyond the blame game is to foster a more compassionate, understanding approach and acknowledge the complexity of family relationships. I just personally don't see how honoring that complexity is simply saying cult brainwashed adult children. And most of her scholarly references in this chapter are about the ways that families talk about estrangement, or separately, the effects of social media on belief polarization. But the vast majority is not about the effects of social media on estrangement. So she's kind of combining two types of research that are actually quite lacking in the scholarly literature. To my knowledge, there's not a ton of research being done on the effect of social media on estrangement. I might have caught like 1 or 2 references in this chapter that were explicitly about that. Then the author claims that adult children self-victimize to make up for their individual failures and to get social power. And here she cites research about locus of control. Yet I feel that she sort of misunderstands this research. Yes, as Dr. King points out, having an internal locus of control, meaning you see yourself in control of what happens to you, is healthiest. However, we are each responsible for our own behavior. So if an adult child comes to their parent and says, "Hey, you hurt my feelings when you did X behavior," then it is that parent's responsibility to take ownership over that. Ironically, if a parent can't do that, then they themselves are displaying an external locus of control, where they feel that somebody else is to blame for their own behavior. Now, the child in turn is responsible for their behavior, so how they move forward from the behaviors that hurt them. So yes, it would be wrong if a child were to come to a parent and say, "I'm a failure because you did this to me." But it's just kind of ironic to me when Dr. King says the allure of playing the victim is relief from the difficult and often uncomfortable journey of self-reflection, personal growth, and accountability, considering those are things that are often missing when abusive, estranged parents are confronted about their behavior. She claims that estranged children find it easier to tell themselves they would have been more successful if they'd had different parents. And I actually only know one person who uses their upbringing as an excuse for their failures. And this person actually did have an extremely abusive parent. The vast majority of people, however, don't complain to their parents that they're not successful enough because of them. They complain that they suffered emotional harm at the hands of their parents. And in the rare cases when someone does just want an excuse for why they aren't more successful, it actually doesn't mean that abuse didn't happen in that relationship. Then the author talks about echo chambers, weaponized therapy speak, and self-diagnosis, and look, those are all things that I've spoken about on my channel as well, and I completely agree with the notion that echo chambers are bad, we shouldn't weaponize therapy speak, and we shouldn't self-diagnose. But I'm just not sure that they apply to this specific situation. I'm not sure that someone saying, "I experienced emotional abuse," or choosing to estrange themselves means that they necessarily are weaponizing therapy speak, or that they were influenced by an echo chamber. And again, it's ironic because she does the same exact things in this book. She also laments that people get sort of increasingly fixed in their narratives over time when they repeatedly tell their story to a supportive group. And I'd just like to point out, that's the goal. When you're trying to heal from trauma, joining a supportive group where you're going to be validated for your experience and you're going to get stronger and stronger in the notion that you didn't deserve what happened to you is very much the point. That's a good thing. Ironically, Dr. King sort of weaponizes therapy speak when she talks about cognitive processing therapy, or CPT. She's kind of giving a false impression of what CPT actually is. She refers to the concept of stuck points in CPT, and she says that common stuck points include, "My parents are completely toxic and haven't done anything good for me. I can never have a relationship with them because they'll never change. Everything wrong in life is because of how they raised me." And she says the point of cognitive processing therapy is to challenge these stuck points. In reality, though, someone would never be in cognitive processing therapy unless they have a trauma history. And if that trauma history is caused by their parents, The therapist would never challenge them to sort of reunify with their abuser. To be clear, they wouldn't encourage estrangement either, but they probably wouldn't focus the therapy on, let's have a more nuanced understanding of the person who abused you. Much more common stuck points include, if I trust anyone, I'll get hurt. The world is a dangerous place. I'm messed up because of what happened to me. Those are much more the sort of stuck points that would be addressed in CPT. Dr. King also claims that adult children have false memories. Now, false memories are absolutely a thing, and that is established in the research, but they happen when someone leads a person into believing that something happened that did not. It does not apply to someone simply saying, hey, this happened to me. I remember this happening to me in my childhood. And then receiving support and validation from other people for that. Claiming that someone has false memories for telling other people about what they experienced is in fact a form of gaslighting. Unless you can prove that someone is actually planting memories in a person, it's very dangerous to tell a person that they're just having a false memory recall. The author also says that it's harmful for grandchildren to be cut off from their grandparents, sort of minimizing or doubting that the grandparents might sometimes genuinely need to be cut off for the grandchildren's own safety. I do agree that it's important for grandchildren to be surrounded by as many loving adults as possible, but sometimes there are genuinely reasons why adult children choose to no longer let their own parents interact with their children. Dr. King also speculates that a lot of adult children cut off their aging parents so that they don't have to help out once their aging parents need help. This is not something that I have ever seen. Not to say it never happens, but in the vast majority of cases I've seen, people cut off their parents usually when they begin processing what happened to them in therapy or with other loving people, when they find a supportive partner or a group of friends or chosen family who treats them better and sort of validates that they didn't deserve what they went through, and when they have children of their own and decide to sever the cycle of trauma. It just so happens that a lot of these milestones tend to happen in early adulthood, which is when parents are reaching retirement age. She also claims that adult children feel entitled to support, such as, receiving an inheritance from their parents, but that they don't want the responsibility of, for instance, helping out their aging parents. Again, I've never personally witnessed this. I'm sure it does happen in rare situations. However, that's not really relevant to estrangement. Most often, if an adult child is choosing to estrange themselves from their parent, they're not wanting anything from them. They don't really care about the inheritance that much. You can't argue that they're entitled or controlling when all they really ask for is to be left alone. She also says that the parents were just doing their job and that we need to acknowledge how much of a sacrifice parenthood is. And look, as a mom to a newborn, I think I can understand very well the sacrifices involved in parenthood because it's incredibly difficult. But if this is a sacrifice that you chose, then you need to take responsibility for it. I have compassion for people who become parents because they were forced or pressured into it, but if you chose it willingly, you don't get to hold it over your child's head. And actually, even if you didn't choose to, you shouldn't hold it over your child's head. Take some responsibility for your own actions. She also believes that parents are often estranged from all of their children, not because all of their children experience the same abuse, but because estranged children recruit their siblings and manipulate them into also cutting off their parents. Again, there's this notion that adult children can't think for themselves. They're too stupid to. Someone must have influenced them or manipulated them into thinking that their parents were abusive. It's a very common perspective that I hear with a lot of estranged parents, and it completely ignores a person's autonomy and agency and ability to think for themselves. The author also criticizes particularly psychodynamic approaches to therapy, modalities that focus on digging up the past. She's even upset that in intake sessions, therapists ask about childhood. Intake sessions must include childhood. They must include risk assessment, a history of the current concern, a treatment plan, an assessment of their lifestyle, and yes, family history. To imply that there's anything wrong with gathering information about family history and a client's upbringing is kind of strange. It strikes me as somewhat defensive. When I was a therapist and I asked people about their childhood, they often needed absolutely no push from me to identify abuse from their parents. From the very first session, they could pinpoint exactly what hurt them from childhood without any influence or leading questions on my part. Contrary to popular belief among the estranged parent community, truly trauma-informed therapy does not ask leading questions because trauma-informed therapists know that you can modify memory that way. They only follow the client's lead because they know memory is fragile, it's prone to rewiring. Dr. King also claims that most people who survive trauma go on to experience post-traumatic growth rather than post-traumatic stress disorder. And reminder here, I have a whole video on post-traumatic growth, but post-traumatic growth and having having a trauma reaction are not mutually exclusive. You can have both of them. And even if most people who experience trauma don't go on to develop a trauma reaction, that doesn't mean that most people with mental health issues don't have a trauma history. Most of them do. And if someone experienced a trauma but not a trauma reaction, doesn't that still warrant estrangement in some cases? Would you tell someone, well, yeah, your parents you, but you turned out fine, right? So why do you need to cut them off? Anyway, she repeatedly makes it seem like CBT is superior to more depth-oriented psychodynamic perspectives in therapy, when in fact, both of them are equally evidence-based and respected within the field of psychology. It of course depends on the specific type of treatment, what specific presenting concern they're best for. But she makes it seem like psychodynamic therapists just want to kind of like line their own pockets by digging up the past in long-term therapy. In reality, she doesn't seem to realize short-term psychodynamic therapy modalities also exist, and solution-focused and depth-oriented treatment modalities often just have different goals. In my experience, long-term depth-oriented therapy has been much more effective for my long-term symptom reduction than trying to put a short-term band-aid on my issues. And besides, it's not all about symptom reduction. My therapist has helped me immensely in being able to overcome hard things, especially in the past year when I've gone through so many hard things. I'm a stronger, more empowered person because of her. It's not all about short-term symptom relief. The author also makes it sound like therapists encourage adult children to cut off their parents, which again is not a common thing that happens. I want to correct a previous statement I made in a video where I was saying that it never happens. Since then I've realized, no, it probably does happen in some cases, but I still maintain that this isn't something that happens often. And if I can explain why for a second, most therapists have it drilled into them that they don't know what is right or wrong for a person's life choices. Life choices have unpredictable consequences. They all have advantages and disadvantages, and a therapist is, in most cases, not going to want to assume responsibility for those advantages and disadvantages. Because if they tell a person, you should cut off your parent, and then bad things end up happening, then the client's going to say, well, you told me to do that. So most therapists know to let the client decide for themselves so they can take some ownership over their choices. Most of the time when someone says, my therapist said this or my therapist wants me to do that, it's more a projection of that person's own feelings. You know, like maybe the therapist said, have you considered setting boundaries with your parents? And the way that a person will hear that is, you're so right, I need to set the boundary of, I no longer want to be in contact with you. And then they'll say to their friends, my therapist told me that I need to cut off my parent. Dr. King makes it sound like most people cut off their parents because of minor complaints like missing a school play, needing to babysit their siblings, but are those the most common reasons that estranged children give? And even if trivial sounding reasons like this are sometimes given, aren't they usually within the context of a larger pattern? No one cuts off their parents because they had to look after their younger siblings one time. If that's what they cite, this was probably one example of many showing how they were parentified. Isolating one incident isn't fair to the totality of that person's experience. Dr. King calls for reform. She tells mental health practitioners they need to do better and must stop exploring childhood as a mandatory first step. She also decides that therapists must adopt solution-focused models and put aside other, well-established, respected, evidence-based treatment modalities just because she said so. I'm sorry, but that's ridiculous. It is ridiculous to tell people to stop exploring childhood when we know that that is one of the many crucial pieces of gathering evidence about a person's life, and it is ridiculous to act like entire subsections of the field of psychology are illegitimate when you as an outsider don't even entirely know what you're talking about. Now, her actual advice for estranged parents is not bad. She says, no contact means no contact, so don't contact them. Now, of course, she says this is for your sake, not theirs, which, of course, at no point in this book were the children's feelings actually considered. She says, don't ask others to intervene, which again is great. She says, don't play the victim, which I find, again, a little bit funny, considering she said estranged parents are treated as subhuman in a similar vein to the Third Reich. She says, focus on yourself, find other sources of meaning, find your chosen family, learn compassion for yourself, for your children. All great advice. But the thing that I find the most ironic is she says at one point, if you are being mistreated, disrespected, or emotionally abused by your adult children, cut them off immediately. Block them on everything. You are now on dangerous territory. So I find it incredibly ironic that someone whose entire thesis is outsiders are encouraging adult children to cut off their parents is the one giving a clear-cut recommendation to people she doesn't know with no nuance whatsoever to cut off their children. This is to me a clear case of projection, where she's accusing others of doing exactly what she's doing. And doesn't that kind of say it all? Let me know what you thought about what I shared in this video, or if you have experiences of your own that relate to this topic, I'd love to read down below in the comments. I hope you have a nice rest of your week, and I'll see you soon.